It has been a long wait for this one. Hey bike geeks, from weight to wheels, price to performance, we're here to take a close look at bicycles so you can make an educated decision when selecting your next bike. In today's video, we're having a close look at the all-new Marin 2024 Alpine Trail 1. This all-new Alpine Trail was teased to us, I think about 2 years ago, by Matt Jones. He was in New Zealand showing us a prototype bike that he was working on. We could tell from looking at the quality of the welds, the quality of the finishing, that the bike he was showing us was way more than a prototype and that we would have something new coming soon. At the time, we couldn't quite tell if that bike he was showing us was going to be something in the range of something like a Rocky Mountain Slayer, something really designed for potentially a dual crown fork, or if it was going to be a new Alpine Trail, a new model to come in above the Alpine Trail. All we knew was that this was going to be a longer travel bike, something even more capable, something that I think a lot of the team riders for Marin were hoping for, something a bit more capable, and that it had a whole bunch of adjustments to it. So this new 2024 Alpine Trail, this is one of 3 different levels of Alpine Trail. This Alpine Trail 1 in Canada is $42.99. The US price is $31.99. There is also an Alpine Trail XR, which is looking like at least a brushed aluminum frame with higher spec componentry, switching ironically back to RockShox for its suspension and to some higher end SRAM componentry. And then there is also an XR AXS version, which that AXS meaning that we're going to wireless componentry at the top version. That XR, the brushed aluminum one I talked about, $61.59 in Canada or $45.99 in the States. The XR AXS, that's one that you've probably seen if you've been paying attention. You've seen some tests of, because it seemed to be the bike that was released to media. It is the bright blue and pink version with all of the fancy componentry. It's already getting some really good feedback, and that one is $72.49 in Canada, $53.99 in the States. For us, in our shop, we have concentrated on bringing in this bike. And it's a little bit of a reflection of this post-COVID crazy world where this bike still stands out at $42.99 in Canada. There isn't much that is going to compare even on those crazy sale bikes that we're seeing. This thing is a standout bike. So the highlights of this bike are, it is a 38.8 pound bike. A little bit on the hefty side, but once we mention that it's 160 millimeters of rear travel, 170 millimeter travel fork, it has a pile of adjustment, and just the overall level of this bike, it isn't too far off the mark of other bikes that we've been looking at recently, other benchmarks I would say in this category, things like the Rocky Mountain Altitude with the same sort of travel numbers, and some extra flip chips on that one too. Flip chips is a big part of the story on this bike. It's going to be flip chips, and then I would say keeping up with every one of the requests that I would say that you commonly see on Pink Bike reviews of bikes. This bike is the answer to pretty much every Pink Bike criticism of bikes that keep on being reviewed on there. And those criticisms are quite often to do with materials, the fact that this is an aluminum bike, price, the fact that so many bikes on Pink Bike that are tested are really out of reach for the everyday man or everyday woman, or everyday rider. So this bike at that $42.99 for a proper performing bike is quite excellent. The fact that this bike is stock set up as a mullet, so a 27.5 rear wheel, 29-inch front wheel. Once again, another thing that we seem to see a lot of Pink Bike interest in. And then there's a few things that I would say that we don't see tons of mention on Pink Bike, but things that are going to be worth discussing and bringing to your attention. So if you're new here, my name is Graham. I'm the owner of a bike shop in Cochrane, Alberta, Canada called Bike Bros. And what I like to do is go through bikes, show you all the details, things that you may not see from either magazine or online reviews, so that you can really understand a bike as if you'd seen it in person. I also throw in my couple cents, not that you need to take me that seriously. I'm just a guy with a bike shop and with a bunch of years in bike shops, but I also bring my own biases and stuff like that. So I just have ideas about things. You don't have to have the same ideas. And hopefully by the end of these videos you understand the bike better, maybe the category a little bit better, or things to consider in a category. Hopefully you end up better informed, probably not entertained, because I'm an extremely boring person to listen to. So we're going to go into specifications, and as we talk about specifications, we're going to hear some ideas from an old man bike shop owner. So to start with, for specifications, we're looking at a $4,300 bike, so we're not going to be looking at super high end, but we are going to be looking at the level of performance where we should be able to expect a bike to work and work really, really well. To go with that theme, we have a Shimano Dior 1x12 drivetrain. So doing all of those things that we expect from a modern drivetrain. It's got a 10 to 51 12-speed cassette on there. These Dior cassettes are long-lasting, tend to be a little bit clunky in their performance, and they're a little bit heavy, but they do work really well. We have FSA Comet cranks. This is the first place where I spotted some errors on the Marin website, because these are 170 millimeters, and although they don't list the length of these cranks in the specifications in their geometry chart, they say that all sizes come with 160 millimeter crank length. So that is false. These are 170s, and as far as I know, we haven't seen a small yet, but 170 seems to be the length on the other sizes in this. This bike does come in 4 different sizes. All of them are set up stock as mullet, and that doesn't matter whether it's an Alpine Trail 1 XR or XR AXS. They are all mullet out of the box. They are, however, fully 29er compatible. And so that is one of the things that we'll end up discussing on here. But before I get there, I'll just go over more of the spec on here. We have these V-tire Snap WCE tires. I haven't actually looked up to see what the WCE stands for, but let's pretend that it's some sort of foreign language way of saying it's a heavy tire with a tread pattern that looks somewhat like a minion. The story that you tend to find on a lot of reviews that talk about these V tires is that excellent traction, especially if you're in looser stuff, not the fastest rolling, and in some cases not great if you're in a place that has a lot of rock slab. But if you're in an area like ours that has a lot of mixed terrain, not a ton of rock slabs, it's probably going to be a good tire. And then when the time comes to replace them, you would most likely be putting some Continentals or Maxxis on to replace them. The stock rims on this bike have no logoing on them. They're 29 millimeter internal width rims, 32 spoke. They're built on Shimano hubs at least, so that is to allow the microspline free hub that this cassette sits on. If there's anything that you're ever going to hear a criticism about a modern Marin bike, it's going to be the wheels. They are a great way of holding on to your tires, but if they take a hard hit, they will damage relatively easily. And that is the one place, and about the only place, that I would say that you can see that they're trying to work towards a certain budget on these bikes. I wish that Marin would improve that wheel quality, because then we could just say this bike, say if it was $4,400 with better wheels, we could just say, yep, $4,400 out of the box, and this thing is awesome. But at the moment, a lot of people, to counter that argument, there's a lot of bikes that come with a really low level but name brand rim on there, which sort of leaves the consumer feeling like a bit of an idiot doing an upgrade, because the wheels are good enough, but they're not great. So in this case, you know that a wheel upgrade is probably one of the low-hanging fruits of things that you want to do on this bike. Going back to specs and close-ups, we have, for a first time that I'm aware of, a horsed link on a Marin full suspension bike. This ties in, if you go back quite a ways back, with conversations with Matt Sipes, who is Marin's product designer. The multi-track system that was used on the previous shorter travel Alpine Trail and on bikes like the Rift Zone, it is a link-driven single pivot bike. And by single pivot, that means that instead of seeing this pivot down here between your rear axle and either your cranks or your main pivot, depending on what you want to reference. So this is a horse link if it's down here. When that link is up top here, that is a linkage-driven single pivot, and that is because your rear axle is going to, on those older style multi-track bikes, your rear wheel is going to follow a very simple arc around your main pivot, which is right in there. Once we get into horse link bikes, what we tend to see with this is that there is a little bit more, typically, this is old school talk, separation between your braking forces and your suspension. And then also, theoretically, you would end up with a little bit more pedaling efficiency. The new multi-track bikes, especially like going up to that last version of the Alpine Trail with 150 millimeters of rear travel, still worked amazingly well. So that argument seems to be that it's just once you're into a much longer travel bike, that's when you need to start doing something as far as putting a pivot here to retain that efficiency, retain that braking independence from your suspension. So an interesting thing on here then is this is one of the few bikes that I have seen that actually incorporates a flip chip into the actual rear linkage here. And this is where basically you're using this, and that is both going to be changing your length of your rear end. So this is a flip chip, it's just a this way or that way kind of a thing. This right now is set up in the low setup. So it could also be called the long setup. So an interesting thing is that by flipping this, we're getting about a 7 millimeter change in the length of the rear end, but it also affects your bottom bracket height off the ground by about 7 millimeters. So that one thing doing those dual purpose adjustments. Now that adjustment you'll be able to use with both wheel sizes that this bike is compatible with. So that is kind of a cool one, because in a lot of companies you'll have some adjustment that happens back here, and that is going to be, the length is going to be more tied into whether or not the bike is big or small wheel compatible. Where we have our flip chip here for our mullet setup, this is an even more dramatic. By changing this back and forth, that actually results in a 20 millimeter height difference of our bottom bracket. And so that is the one that they basically have one set up strictly for mullet and one strictly for 29. If maybe somebody loved the feel of a super high bottom bracket, I don't see any issue with running a 29 on the rear wheel still in the mullet setup, but that has been their way of making the practical options available between geometry and mullet setup. So as I mentioned, horse link, that puts it in the same sort of realm as, horse link was synonymous with Specialized for a long time. Now you're seeing it on a few brands now that there is no longer a patent on that. So sophisticated suspension design. I don't think necessarily better this new multi-track 2LT, so that LT part of the name is for long travel as far as I can tell. This bike is probably as effective pedaler and braker as the old Alpine Trail, just modernized to make it as good while still being longer travel. So we're a long ways into this and we've only talked about flip chips. We have a nice detail back here. Our cable routing is really tidy on this bike. This is a little guard similar to what we see on pivots and things like that when you have linkage and you don't want to get rocks tossed into your linkage at the back. There's a few companies doing some sort of a guard back here. In this case, it is doing double duty. It's a bolt-on little rubber thing, but hidden inside there is where our cables for the rear derailleur and our brake lines are actually coming through the frame and then exiting and then going straight into our chainstays. So a very, very clean cable routing design. We've got nothing hanging out the bottom here, so a very nice thing to see. Let's get back to some more detail. So there's that pivot, or the switcheroo flip chip from Mullet to 29, a nice one-piece rocker link, a new style gusset here, similar to the way that the new rift zones have been changed. And we also have a little bit of a tool dock, kind of a mounting system here. If your computer screen or your phone screen is really, really good at figuring out size, this is actually now a 34.9 millimeter diameter dropper seat post on here. So that is kind of following some modern trend that we're seeing on a few bikes, but not many. So that just means that we basically have a fatter diameter seat post here, which means the actual telescoping part of this post is that much fatter. So we get a way stronger dropper post. Speaking of dropper posts, this bike in a size small would have a 150 millimeter drop on here. In medium and large, 170. And then once we go to XL, it's actually a 200 millimeter drop. So I think we're getting dropper post sizes very much in line with frame sizes, which is nice to see. On our down tube on this bike, we will see a interesting thing here. That is a removable door for your little down tube storage. This is not a simple one to do the one-handed trick that I like to show. So I'm showing it partially there. Let's see, I'm not going to be able to put this back on. There we go. Inside there is a little bag that Marin gives with the bike. A nice detail on this little bag is that it actually has these little tabs on here. So anybody that's used one of these down tube storage things and had something heavy and had the bag shoot down, low down into the down tube, having these little tabs at either end is nice, because at least you'll have something that you can get a finger around and pull your thingy out of. On the door on here, we have the usual mounts for a water bottle. So we do just have single water bottle positioning on here, and relatively easy to use. And then the other mounts there, like I said, that is more for a tool dock. Going back to cable routing discussion, we no longer have the little push in and certainly pop out little rubber grommets. We now at least have little screwed in and a little bit more rigid little ports for where the cables go into the frame. Going back to spec, we have a Fox Float Performance rear shock. So this is a relatively simple shock, no piggyback or anything, but that is reflective of the $4,300 price point. We do at least have basically a firmer switch or an open switch, and then the rebound, of course, is going to be our red dial there, and then it is an air shock. I don't know if I mentioned when I was talking about the post, that is a Trans X is the brand on there. Good quality clamps. These are probably better than some of the brand name posts out there, even though they're Trans X. So don't let brand name necessarily tell you which is or isn't good. We have a pretty boring looking Marin saddle on here. Got a little bit of squish on there, pretty flat in profile. I'm going to step back a little bit. Head tube angles on these bikes are roughly in the 63-degree range. Seat tube angles roughly in the 78-degree range. So very, very modern as far as seat tube angle goes. For people who aren't used to riding modern trail bikes, now that we're getting into seat tube angles in the high 70-degree range, you better be really, really good at using your dropper post, because when your seat is at max height for good pedaling efficiency, you will barely be able to reach the ground with your toes. So steep seat tubes and dropper posts are basically a synonymous, or they're related in their practicality. That super steep seat tube does put your weight very centered on the bike. So it's going to help this bike, even with a 63-degree head tube angle, to not feel too wandery when you're on climbs. As I discussed this stuff here too, the rear end on this bike, that will change, I think I mentioned, by about 7 millimeters, whether or not we're in the short or the long mode. That 7 millimeter change is from about 435 to 442 millimeters for chainstay length. So instead of giving you a graduated chainstay length, like some companies are basically changing that depending on the size of the bike, I like the idea of the rider being able to choose whether or not they want a long stable bike, or if they want a slightly shorter, more playful bike. And I think that those numbers put us in the range. 435 would be pretty short for this, especially if you're up into a size large or extra large. 442, a little bit more proportionate, but you might get somebody on an XL who really wants a short rear end and wants to be able to fling the rear end of the bike around, and they're less concerned with just overall stability. Going back to flip chip type conversations, if you've watched my recent videos on either the Giant Trance X, Rocky Mountain Instinct, or Rocky Mountain Altitudes, what they are doing is doing flip chips in the headset to basically give you some reach adjustment. What Marin is doing is they are doing an interesting take on doing an angle set. So what you get with a Marin in the box is this bottom cup, or top cup, sorry. And the one that comes on the bike is a neutral setup. And then on here we have either a plus or minus 0.75 degrees. So, and then this is also, if we can see, I'm trying to get the light to glimmer off there. There is machined flats inside the head tube of the frame here that make sure that this thing can't be put in cockeyed, so that once you put this thing in, you're not going to have your fork angled off in either direction, which I think is a really nice touch. It's just make sure then that you're not going to have issues, especially because this thing is actually not a press fit cup. It has rubber O-rings in here. That means that this, you can basically, with some finger strength, you can actually pop out the one cup and then just shove this thing in. And to make that happen, on the bottom here they have a special, what looks like Delrin sort of in-between cup that goes between the bearing and the actual cup in the frame. So a very interesting way to give us a simple adjustable head tube angle with only a single cup and not requiring tools. So an interesting thing. This is one of those things that I haven't seen mentioned in any of the talk about this bike with the online reviews. And for me personally, if I was interested in this bike, it would be of great interest to me to learn how the heck they did this. And it was of great interest to me until we actually saw this bike show up and I got to put it together and play with the parts. On the front of this bike, we're looking at a Fox 36. This is a Rhythm. If you've seen me talking about the Fox lineup, what you have at the entry price point is often a Rhythm, then a Performance Elite, or Factory in the graduated system of Fox's stuff. What this basically means is we have the same lower as a Fox Factory or a Performance Elite. We have a slightly different crown on here, so this crown is just slightly heavier. We still have a standard grip damper, so I guess this is different now that Fox just released some new stuff. But this is a grip damper, which is just a low speed compression We have open, we have closed, which is basically a lockout, and then we have these in-between stages of low speed compression adjustment. So for a lot of riders, I think that this is basically the ideal fork. You don't get enough adjustments that you can screw up your bike, and you get a more obvious open and closed sort of a setting. As part of that whole thing, we also then have our rebound adjustment. This isn't the knob, this is the cover for the actual rebound adjustment. That would be that red thing there. So awesome fork. I would have no problems using a rhythm fork and considering it to be a high performance fork even. I love the idea for people who aren't super techno weenies and just want a bike that rides really well and that they can't screw up its performance by making bad adjustments. An air fork with a grip damper, awesome. Front wheel, we're looking at the same sort of tires on here, those V tires. I should mention, I didn't mention before, but they're 2.6 inches wide. So pretty big tires that are on here, the front being 29, but also that 29 millimeter internal. We get these really nice new Marin grips that they're actually selling even aftermarket. I think these are a really nice feeling grip. They've got a little bit of sort of a profile thing here that gives you a little bit of extra comfort. They are lock-on, just a single lock-on. And what's right next to them I find to be really interesting. These are TRP slate brakes. I was an early adopter when Aaron Gwynn got sponsored or was sponsored by TRP, and they came out with what was supposed to be a really exciting brake, the Quadium. I don't think I've had a brake that I hated any more than that TRP Quadium. It felt like garbage, and every single time I kept on trying to reuse it on a different bike, thinking that I was judging it poorly. That brake was crap. This TRP slate, between the lever shape, between the actual feel of these things, I'm quite impressed, and I think that this is a really nice move because for this price point we often wouldn't see a very fancy brake if it was a Shimano brake offered, but here we have a mineral oil brake, 4-piston, a similar ability to do cheater bleeds on it, and then we have some tool-free adjustment, which I know some people really like on their brakes. So I'm very impressed with this. I'm really looking forward to hearing people's actual on the mountain experience, but just from the kind of test rides on this bike, I think these brakes feel amazing. Inboard of that brake, a Dior shifter, nothing exciting to talk about there. It's just a shifter, it goes up and down in speeds. Marin handlebars with a 31.8 clamp, they're 780 millimeters wide, and this kind of puny looking Marin 32 millimeter long stem on here. I'm kind of a nerd as far as liking to like what I look down at on my bike, so I mean if I was to buy this bike I would probably switch out that stem to something that just screams quality, maybe something with some color on there, maybe even a blue to go with the speckled blue on the down tube, on the forks and on the rear end. What else can I talk about? The brakes on this thing, going back to those again. I have to step over my little table here. 203 rotors, front and rear. They're a nice spidered rotor on here. So the black part is alloy, the outside stainless steel. By doing the two materials, that alloy actually helps to pull heat out of the actual braking surface. In addition to the dual materials, we also have 2.3 millimeter thick rotors on here. So that thicker rotor is going to be less likely to warp from getting up to excessive heat. So it's a nice touch that down to even the quality of the rotors is quite exceptional. The one thing you notice, because when these bikes are shipped to us, the rotors aren't on the wheels. By going 2.8 or 2.3 millimeters wide, these rotors are actually a fair amount heavier than a sort of normal width rotor. So when we're talking about that 38.8 pounds that I mentioned on this bike earlier, there are little things on this bike that they could have made the bike lighter if they had done them, like just standard width Shimano rotors. But this bike is all about, or mostly about, descending. It is still going to pedal uphill quite well, so you don't have to be in a place that has chairlifts or is all about shuttle riding. But this bike is unapologetically a bike about going downhill, going over huge jumps, doing steeps. Everything is favoring that stuff, and then they do what they can to make it comfortable and doable as far as the climbs go. So if you're wondering if this bike is for you and if you like going out and doing meandering loops, I would say no, this bike is not for you. If you're somebody who, when you leave the house, all you can think about is your favorite big jumps or drops or steeps where you're actually spraying some rocks and stuff like that, this is 100% a bike for you. Everything about it, from the geometry to the adjustments to that mullet setup, which is going to give you a nimble, playful sort of a turning bike. This bike is all about descending, enjoying the descent, being tough enough for the descent, and that is its story. It's as if it was designed for riding from the alpine down to the subalpine. And maybe that's why it is the Alpine Trail 1. If you're still here, you are a total bike nerd, and you may as well like and subscribe.